Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with Jess Mazour from Sierra Club in Iowa, who's going to be talking to us about the amazing job that she's been doing organizing on the ground there against CO2 pipelines. And so I just wanted to introduce her before I turn it over to her. Jess Mazour is a lifelong Iowan who found her passion in agriculture, local foods, and the environment through her nonprofit work. She currently works as the Conservation Program Coordinator for the Sierra Club Iowa chapter. Jess has worked with communities across the state that have been impacted by industrial agriculture pollution, and Jess advocates for intersectional vision of agriculture for the health of our communities, our environment, our citizens, and our bodies. Jess has worked with Senator Bernie Sanders to develop his Rural Revitalization Plan and other federal and state leaders to advance good agricultural, rural, and food policies. And so this CO2 pipeline situation is a little far afield of agriculture, but why don't you get started and let us know how you ended up doing this and what you've discovered working on the ground, Jess.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. Thanks for inviting me to speak. My name is Jess Mazour, and I'm the Conservation Program Coordinator for the Sierra Club Iowa chapter, like Karen mentioned. And we have a really big thing happening in Iowa and all across the Midwest. There's new proposed carbon pipeline projects, and Iowa and South Dakota and North Dakota and Minnesota and Illinois and Nebraska are building a huge resistance to these pipelines, and we're hopefully going to set the stage for what this can look like across the country. So I'm excited to talk to you all today and tell you about what we're doing here in Iowa to stop the 3 carbon pipeline projects that are coming through here. So I'm going to share my screen. So we'll start with just kind of a quick overview of what's happening here in Iowa. So there are 3 proposed interstate carbon pipelines. We've heard rumors of a 4th and a 5th, but we haven't heard anything really about them other than just rumors. But the scheme of this is, what they're saying on their side is that they're going to capture emissions from polluters like ethanol plants, fertilizer plants. We assume probably some coal-fired power plants might end up on the route as well. But right now they're just mostly focusing on ethanol and fertilizer plants. They're going to capture the CO2 emissions, compress it from a gas into a liquid so that it can then be piped up to North Dakota, or in our case, down to Illinois, to be permanently stored underground. And I'm put quotes around that because we don't really believe that that's the true intention of what they're going to do with the CO2, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. And why do they want to do this? Well, these pipeline companies say that the reason they want to do it is they're going to solve climate change and they're going to save and expand the ethanol industry. But we know that the real reason for these carbon pipeline projects, why we're seeing so many all at once, is about the money. They're going to make massive profits off of taxpayer dollars and taxpayer tax credits and other public resources through programs like the federal 45Q tax credit, states like California's low carbon fuel markets, and then other revenue sources. So let's go over the 3 that are being proposed in Iowa. The first one is Summit. It's owned by Bruce Rastetter. If you are in the Midwest, especially in Iowa, you know that name. He's like a political kingpin. He does land grabs for a living. He has ethanol plants in Brazil. He tried to take land from over 100,000 refugees in Tanzania, and now he's trying to take land from Iowa farmers. This project is the largest CCS project being proposed in the nation. It impacts Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa. They have completed their informational meetings as part of the Iowa process, and they've actually filed for their permit. So we are in that time where we are trying to stop it. They have an active permit. We think it'll be about a year before there's a final hearing. So we're in that time where there's a lot of back and forth and legal challenges and everything. And then recently, Summit just announced that they partnered with a coal plant in North Dakota right near their sequestration site. So Summit continues to say that they're going to permanently sequester this carbon underground and solve our climate crisis. But the fact that they are hooking up with oil, the fact that they're going up to North Dakota to where the Bakken oil fields are, just screams that they're really going to be using the CO2 in a process called enhanced oil recovery, to pump oil out of the ground that's hard to get. So when you put CO2 in, you can, almost like fracking, you put something in, it pushes it out easier. So that's what a lot of CCS projects are used for. So we have major suspicions that the end result with the CO2 from Summit is not just going to be permanently sequestered. The second one is Navigator. Navigator is owned by Valero, BlackRock, and Navigator CO2 Ventures. It impacts Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Illinois, and Iowa. Their plan is to collect CO2 at the end of these points and take it down to sequestration site in Illinois. Again, we also have major concerns that it's not truly just sequestration. This is enhanced oil recovery. We know that in that area, there's also oil fields. So it's also going to an area where EOR is already being done. Navigators completed their informational meetings, but they haven't filed a permit yet. So we're still kind of in a waiting game. They were scheduled to file in May, but we just found out because of our work in resisting this, that they had actually pushed back their filing schedule till late summer or early fall. So that's good news. Anytime we can delay, we know that time is money. And so we want to make this as hard as possible for them. And currently Navigator's trying to survey people's land, trying to get access to people's land. The third one is ADM Wolf. We know the least about this pipeline. It's about 150 miles, but I think we're only seeing a piece of this pipeline route. ADM Wolf also owns CCS projects in Canada. And so I have this suspicious feeling that we're just seeing a little section that goes from Iowa. I know this map's kind of hard to see, but this is Cedar Rapids, which is in eastern Iowa, and just going down to Illinois. So it's a short route. I think it's longer and we're just not seeing the rest of it. And you can tell that we don't even really know where it goes. This is the only map we've seen. So we're just kind of guessing which landowners are impacted. But they have been meeting with county supervisors. So we know that we expect to see some sort of filing in the near future. And this is a kind of a scary map that just shows, what the vision for these CCS carbon pipelines are going to look like across the US. You can see that this is going to touch almost every state. When you look at this map, this has one nice little line through Iowa. Like if we actually wanted these pipelines, that's a minimal impact. But what we're seeing is all these companies are racing for those federal 45Q tax credits. So you're seeing multiple companies, multiple routes. The Navigator and Summit pipeline in Iowa cross each other 12 times. That's just how there's no science to this. They're just trying to get these projects in to get their hands on those tax credits. So some of the core issues, which I think is really important to focus on all the different issues, because that's what's brought so many people together that are unlikely allies, because no matter what you believe in or what your values are, you're going to find a reason that impacts you to be against it. And so we've been very clear that these are the top 5 reasons we hear. You don't have to agree with all of them, but as long as you agree with one of them, you're in this coalition. And that's allowed us to build a coalition that includes farmers and landowners and environmentalists and Indigenous people and local governments. And when we're talking about Iowa, I know that we've been told for a long time that Republicans and Democrats are supposed to hate each other and that we have nothing in common. And these issues really brought us together because everyone can see something in this that they care about. So the main reasons that we're hearing from people that don't want these pipelines is from farmers and landowners. One of their biggest concerns is that this permanently damages the land. And I'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail in a minute. That eminent domain should not be used for private gain. These are all about the money and the public's going to pay so that these pipeline companies can profit. Carbon pipelines are incredibly dangerous. These are not like an oil pipeline, which is also dangerous. This is a completely different beast. And then these aren't a climate change solution. It's greenwashing. And finally, nobody wants these pipelines other than the people that stand to benefit from it. So let's just dig in a bit on some of these issues that we're hearing a lot from landowners. We know that pipeline construction damages land. We had Dakota Access come through our state a few years ago. That was the first hazardous liquid materials pipeline of that magnitude that went through Iowa. So we really learned a lot. We were told, oh, your land's going to be restored to the way it was. you won't even know that there's pipeline there, and it's just simply not the way it played out. These are some documents and pictures from an investigation into the construction of Dakota Access from some landowners who are now trying to file litigation on the damage to their land. And you can just see that, like, how much heavy equipment is on Iowa's topsoil. And Iowa has some of the richest topsoil in the state. It can be compacted, and once it's compacted, it's almost like cement. Water can't seep into it, crops, roots can't grow down into it, and then you can't grow anything out of it. And when you have this much equipment on your land, you're compacting that soil. And then here you can see what happens when there's compaction. Water is no longer soaking into the ground, it's sitting on top of it. And then this is a few years after the pipeline was built, after they told us our land would be completely restored. You can still see the scar across the land right here. And that's all across the state. If you go on Google Earth and you zoom in, there is a scar dissecting Iowa from the Dakota Access pipeline. So landowners are rightfully concerned about what's going to happen to their land. Second one, eminent domain should not be used for private gain. Plain and simple. Eminent domain is meant for projects that truly benefit the public. Things like water lines, things like highways and roads that people rely on, not for private carbon pipeline projects, not for Dakota Access, not for these kind of projects. They should not be able to take people's land for private gain. And then we even step back a little farther, we're all on stolen land. So I think we have to keep that in mind as well. But Iowa's process is so heavily determined on eminent domain and landowner resistance that this is like a very core issue in our fight. And it's been really important to focus on eminent domain as a way to build that coalition with the landowners who in Iowa tend to be probably more conservative, and the environmentalists tend to be more liberal. And so we're working together. We've got to find that common ground. And I think we can all agree that land shouldn't be taken for private gain. Next issue is that the public pays and the pipelines profit. I mentioned earlier these 45Q federal tax credits. This is a tax credit that I believe was started, under Bush, and then expanded under Obama, expanded under Trump, and now here under Biden. So it's bipartisan. It's not a Republican or Democrat thing, but it is a tax credit that was meant to help fund climate change solutions. And unfortunately, CCS is not a climate change solution, and it should not be getting any of these 45Q federal tax credits. The pipeline companies are going to get $50 a ton if they permanently sequester it, meaning they take the CO2 and pump it into the ground and leave it there forever. And they'll get $35 a ton if they do enhanced oil recovery. And so we know that enhanced oil recovery is definitely not a climate solution when we're pumping more oil out of the ground. So it should definitely not be included in the 45Q federal tax credit. But in general, I don't think CCS at all should be included in the 45Q federal tax credit. Another funding source for these pipeline companies is the low carbon fuel standards, specifically in states like California. That's the state that gets brought up all the time on these projects. Is if we build these pipelines, we're going to lower ethanol's carbon intensity score, and then they're going to be able to sell the ethanol to a state like California at a premium price. And I think we have to look at that in the long term and really think about, is that good? Because one, we know that when we grow so much corn and beans here in Iowa, we have a water problem. Two, we know that states like California are the states that are the fastest to electrify their vehicle fleet. And that means the demand for ethanol is going to go down. And when the demand for ethanol goes down, the price of corn is going to go down. And where does that leave all the farmers in Iowa who've been asked to plant fence row to fence row corn and beans? So I think we have to think about what is the long-term solution for that. We need to think about how we re-envision agriculture in a way that benefits our environment and our communities and our farmers, and not put all of our eggs into a basket of ethanol, which we know was never meant to be a forever fuel. It was always meant to be a bridge fuel. Studies are now coming out saying that ethanol is as dirty, if not more dirty, than the production of gasoline. And I think that we have to look at the long-term solution for climate change. It's not ethanol. And the other thing I think is really important is when ethanol was introduced and when we started subsidizing it and saying this is a bridge fuel because it's so much cleaner than gasoline and fossil fuels, we need to use this ethanol as we transition. Now they're saying ethanol's so dirty that we need to put CCS equipment on the top of it and capture the CO2 emissions and pipe it to North Dakota or Illinois. So which one is it? I think it really points out that this is all a farce. Like the ethanol industry from the beginning is it clean and so clean that we need to use it as a transition fuel? Or is it so dirty that we now need to invest billions of public dollars to capture its emissions? It's just drawing a lot of really important conversations I think Iowa needs to have so that we can have longevity for our state. And then also there's going to be lots of externalized costs. Counties are spending countless resources and time on this project. Landowners are hiring attorneys, driving to meetings. The Iowa Department of Natural Resources, Iowa Utilities Board, Iowa Department of Transportation, all these public agencies are expending resources on these projects. Also, these pipelines are incredibly dangerous. There was a pipeline rupture in Satarsha, Mississippi in 2020, and it sent over 40 people to the hospital, had to evacuate the town of Satarsha. The thing that I think is important to know is, like, unlike oil, which is a liquid, this is immediately, once there's a rupture, it turns from a liquid to a gas and it expands. And so you get kind of like an explosion essentially. And then CO2 is heavier than air. So it's not just going to go straight up in the air and disperse. It's actually going to go down to low-lying areas and settle down on the ground. It displaces that oxygen, which means if you are in that CO2 cloud, you can't breathe. If you try to get in your car to drive away and escape, your car's not going to work because gas combustion engines need oxygen. CO2, and especially when we're talking about this, not just the CO2 in your pop can, but we're talking about industrial CO2. It's a toxicant and asphyxiant, and in high enough quantities, you can die. EMS and hospitals aren't prepared. EMS can't get to you if you're in the cloud because their gas combustion fire trucks or ambulances or whatever can't get to you. Hospitals, especially in rural parts of the country in Iowa, our hospitals are underfunded and understaffed, and they're closing, and hospitals aren't prepared for a mass gassing. And I think the important thing to understand too is just how quickly this happens. CO2, when there's a rupture, they did a test rupture in Europe of a pipe that's similar size, similar temperature, similar depth. And in that test rupture, the cloud spread 1,300 feet in under 4 minutes. The pipelines in Iowa, some of them are as close as 60 feet to people's houses. And that's a really important talking point that I think has helped unite us, is that we all care about our families and our neighbors and our communities, and we want to keep them safe. Greenwashing. These projects delay and redirect resources away from known solutions like wind and solar and battery storage and efficiency and research. And this big potential that CO2 will be used for enhanced oil recovery is a huge red flag that this is not a climate change solution if we're going to be pumping more oil and burning more oil with the CO2 that's captured. Also, CCS in general, even if it was permanently sequestered, is only capturing just a tiny fraction of the overall emissions, but it's so incredibly expensive that this just isn't a good use of money if we're trying to look at the most efficient way to actually start to reduce our emissions and solve the climate crisis. And it's incredibly energy intensive, just the act of capturing the emissions and separating out the CO2 for ethanol has a pretty clean stream of CO2, but when we're talking about the fertilizer plants or coal-fired power plants, it takes a lot of energy to separate the gases and compress them into a liquid and pipe them up. So because there are all of these reasons that this is bad for not only the land and people and the future of our planet, it's allowed us to form a really unique coalition. Our coalition is made up of farmers and landowners and Indigenous people and environmentalists and local governments. And it showed us that this is not a Republican or a Democrat issue. It's a right or wrong issue. And the fact that, when I was organizing this, the minute we found out about this, we knew we needed to start talking to landowners because the process in Iowa is so heavily determined on what landowners think. During Dakota Access, we didn't know that. And a lot of landowners did resist. They hired their own lawyers, but they didn't work together. There was no united landowner group. And that makes it easy for these pipeline companies to pick people off one by one. So that was our goal initially. We've got to get people together, people united, acting together in a united legal strategy. And that's what we did. And those first phone calls were so fascinating because everyone at first was like, well, wait a minute, Sierra Club, you know, I'm a Republican. I don't want to work with the Sierra Club. And, you know, just a little bit of talking and listening and digging into the issue, all of a sudden we realized we had a lot in common. And now we're working together on a regular basis. And you know, we don't agree on everything, but we've found out that we actually have a lot in common. This divide between the left and the right really is not that deep when you dig in and focus on an issue that directly impacts people, because we do have a lot in common. And if we can all agree that we care for our land and our families and our neighbors and our communities, it makes it really easy to figure out what's the best for the future. And it forces people to work together, have tough conversations, and it's the change that we really need in this country. So going into the Iowa process, just so people kind of know where we're at in this, it's really, like I've been saying, heavily determined on landowner support. So that's the first step. We got landowners together. The pipeline companies immediately have to have informational meetings in every impacted county. And so that was a great opportunity for us to meet impacted landowners. We went to those meetings, we handed out flyers, we brought petitions, we followed up with people with phone calls, and we met a lot of people that way. And then the word just kind of spread like a wildfire of, hey, we don't have to sign these easements, do we? There's a lot of people that aren't signing. After the informational meetings, the companies will file an actual permit. Summit's the only one that's done that so far. And then there will be a public hearing and then a formal decision. And after that, anyone who has not signed an easement at that point would go through the eminent domain process. We don't think we're ever going to get that far, because this is an unseen resistance happening not only in Iowa, but all across the Midwest. 80% of the landowners on the route have still not signed easements, and that's after 7 months of negotiation. So it's just really precedent-setting resistance and legal strategy that we're working with right now. We don't expect there to be any public hearings, like that final hearing where a decision will be made, until 2023. And our goal is to continue to push that back farther and farther and farther, so we have more time to reach out to more people, engage more communities, and build that resistance. So what is the resistance? It's not just Iowa. There is a lot of national groups, which I'm sure some of you on this call are part of those national groups who are studying CCS, and we are very thankful for that, because we did not know a lot or anything about CCS, you know, in September of 2021. This all happened like wham, bam, 1 in a row or 3 in a row. And we had to do a lot of learning. So it's been really helpful to be able to read the research and understand CCS from people who've been looking into it for a while. Dan Ziegert wrote that the gassing of Satarsha story, did the investigation into the pipeline rupture in Mississippi. That has been so incredibly helpful, because I think understanding how these pipelines are different and the risks that they pose to our communities has really allowed us to open the door to have conversations with people that, you know, we might normally not be in conversation with, because that's something we can easily agree with, talking about the dangers, and that opens the door to then be able to talk about climate change and talk about land destruction and everything else. There are weekly updates, weekly action steps. These people meet regularly, and we act together, and there's constant media outreach. In statewide resistance, like I said, we started meeting with landowners immediately. We hold weekly Zoom meetings. I send out an email every Thursday to over 1,000 landowners that are in our group resisting, and it has updates in the process. It has news articles, it has action steps, and then local updates. And I think that's been really important for people to continually know what's going on, what they should be doing locally and statewide. And then we also built the Carbon Pipeline Resistance Coalition here in Iowa. And that consists of the Sierra Club Iowa chapter, Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, Food and Water Watch Iowa, Great Plains Action Society, Science and Environmental Health Network, And there's other organizations that are starting to get more involved, and hopefully we'll be able to bring them into the coalition. One of those key organizations that's really helping us with ethanol talking points, because that's one of the hardest talking points on this, is because a lot of the people who are impacted by this are farmers that are growing corn for ethanol. So that's a challenge. And I think the group that has really stepped up and kind of helping us combat that angle is Iowa Farmers Union has officially come out against the pipeline, and they have a petition. We're going to get them in the coalition. But that's helpful to say farmers, even if your livelihood is dependent on ethanol, they still recognize that the destruction from these pipelines isn't worth it. And that's really helpful in a communication standpoint. Then there's also, oops, I forgot to advance that slide there. There's also local resistance. So we have been, we're able to GIS map the route and get the best guess of who all the impacted landowners are. We've done mailings, we've done calls, and we've been really pushing them to get counties to object, because we know that we need every entity possible to help fight this pipeline. And we have a plan for counties that, one, we get them to object and state their opposition to the pipelines. Two, we're going to ask these counties to pass ordinances that will, one, put roadblocks in the way of the pipeline company's approval. And then two, in the event that they are approved, it adds protections to landowners and to counties. And then the final thing we're going to ask counties to do is to intervene in the process to protect their ordinance and to protect their county. So the opposition, like just getting counties to object, has been going on for a few months now. We're doing fantastic. I actually haven't updated the slide because it should say 32 out of 52 counties have objected. So we're at, these numbers might be slightly off, so I have to see which counties recently added, but 21 out of 30 summit impacted counties, which, I mean, just incredible. That's almost all of the counties saying, no, we don't want this. And most of the objections are to eminent domain specifically. Navigator impacted counties, 17 out of 36. ADM Wolf, 2 out of 5. But again, we don't know the route. So I think we'll do a lot more in that area of the state as we see their application come in. You can kind of see just of the routes, just the resistance that we're building. It's pretty incredible. We've also been engaging legislatively. We had a Republican Senator Jeff Taylor, who introduced a great bill that would have banned eminent domain for private projects altogether. We also had a version that banned eminent domain for carbon pipelines specifically, but he liked the broad one that would have also protected us from future oil pipelines, methane pipelines, hydrogen pipelines, all of the above. And we actually had some momentum. We had a subcommittee where it passed out 3-0, and then it was put into a committee, and we expected it to pass out of committee, and literally before the meeting started, it was pulled from the agenda. And so it really shows that there's a lot of political connections with these pipeline companies that are pulling strings behind the scenes, which is why we have to build this coalition and fight back, because we can't count on any one of our solutions to be like the one that works. It's gonna be like death by 1,000 cuts, trying everything possible. But some of the political connections on this are Governor Reynolds started a carbon sequestration task force, and she appointed Summit, Navigator, Valero, ADM, all to this carbon sequestration task force. Former Governor Terry Branstad is now working for Summit. Tom Vilsack, USDA Secretary of Ag, his son is Summit's general counsel. 2 former chief of staffs for Governor Reynolds and Governor Branstad now work for Summit. The Navigator's general counsel is a former counsel for the Iowa Utilities Board, who will approve or deny the project. So just, you can kind of see they're really trying to line up the political support that they need, but they really underestimated the opposition. So we're doing really well, but that we did not get a bill passed this session. The session is still happening. Something could happen, but it's unlikely. So we're transitioning this into an electoral fight to say, we're not going to vote for any elected official or candidate that doesn't support its constituents. And the constituents are loud and clear. We don't want these pipelines. We've generated thousands of calls and emails. We're showing up to legislative meetings. We held a huge public hearing with over 100 landowners. And that was our first event where we brought the whole coalition together. So it was an incredible event where we had landowners and Indigenous people and environmentalists all in the same room fighting for the same thing. And I think another really important part of this is the legal resistance. The landowners during Dakota Access, like I said, a lot of them hired their own lawyer, which is really expensive. And it also means there's multiple legal strategies, and it's, you end up a lot of times negotiating rather than fighting the pipeline. So we decided from the beginning, we need a united legal resistance. And so landowners formed the Iowa easement team and hired Domina Law Group. And Domina Law Group is the attorneys that help stop the KXL pipeline. And they did that through just constant legal challenges year after year, and building a team of landowners that acted together and resisted together. And I think that that's really important to this. And now the pipelines, these 3 pipelines first announced in Iowa. So Iowa is really kind of the farthest along of all the Midwest states that are impacted by these, but now it's spreading. So Domina Law Group is representing Iowa landowners and Nebraska landowners and South Dakota landowners. I think they're in talks with North Dakota landowners. And then not 100% sure about Minnesota or Illinois, but I know that everyone's kind of working together and paying attention. But that's going to be really important to this campaign to see what happens when landowners not only in Iowa unite, but across all the Midwest, and a united strategy. So talking a little bit more about that united strategy. So Minnesota, what they're doing right now is CO2 is not classified as a hazardous liquid material up in Minnesota. So they're working to get it classified as a hazardous material. They're doing a lot more. I just don't have all of the updates, but I know that they are holding landowner meetings and getting people notified. But they've been doing a lot up in Minnesota. And the organization that I know has been doing the most, I think, is CURE. And then in South Dakota, so Iowa was the first state to hear about these pipelines, but South Dakota is going to be the first state to have a final decision. Their process is much quicker than Iowa's process. So they are working with a precedent-setting number of landowners to intervene in the process. I think normally with pipelines in South Dakota, I think they said that the highest number of landowner interveners was under 100, if I remember correctly, and they now have over 300 that are already requesting to intervene. And that will continue to grow as new routes are announced and everything. So that's really exciting to see what's happening in South Dakota. Nebraska has been holding meetings with landowners and getting folks signed up with Domina Law Group. And they have a lot of experience fighting the KXL pipeline, which is going to be helpful. And I should say in South Dakota, the organization is Dakota Rural Action. In Nebraska, the one that I see doing the most is Bold, Nebraska. And then in Illinois, they have not only the pipeline, but the sequestration site as well. So they have landowners resisting on the pipeline route and over the sequestration site, which is going to be really important because we need to have that angle as well, that no, we don't want the CO2 under us. And so they have a coalition that's formed with a number of environmental groups. There's Soil, which is like Save Our Illinois Land, Environmental Justice Collaborative, Sierra Club Illinois chapter, and a few others. And then in North Dakota, same situation. They have not only the pipeline, but the sequestration site, and they have a really strong fight back there. Counties are passing objections, and they have a huge chunk over the sequestration site that has been locked down with landowners. So this is really precedent setting to see this kind of coordination happening all across the Midwest. So what's our superpower, and why are we going to stop this pipeline and we're never even going to get to these final hearings? It's because we have a united coalition of unlikely allies who are joining together to stop the pipelines. We're willing to set aside our differences and work together. And I have never talked more about tile lines, which for those of you who don't know, tile lines help drain the land in Iowa so they can farm it. I'm not the biggest fan of tile lines. But I've never talked more about tile lines than now, because I know that's really important to the landowners who are farming the land, and vice versa. I'm sure these landowners have never talked about climate change more in their life than they have now, because that's one of the issues that's front and center on this. So it's really bringing people together and kind of forcing us to look from another perspective and figure out how we can find commonality. And again, our coalition is farmers, landowners, environmentalists, Indigenous people, and local governments. And that's allowing us to go at this from all angles. If I can't, our legislature is Republican controlled. The House, Senate, and governor's office are Republican controlled. So I don't have a lot of power over our legislators, but the landowners do. And then vice versa. Summit continues to say that this is about climate change. And so landowners need the environmental groups to say, no, this isn't about climate change. This is greenwashing. And so the fact that we all can influence different kinds of people really gives us an advantage. And I think Summit, Navigator, and ADM Wolf really underestimated Iowans' willingness to fight back and save our state. And they were not prepared for us to be able to understand what CCS is so quickly and to be able to fight back, to organize, they did not expect that Republicans and environmentalists would be willing to work together like this. And I think that they have tried multiple times. They have attack ads running across the state on Sierra Club right now. And because we have built these relationships on trust and this common goal of saving our state, people are looking past that. And I think that that's really important. And if we continue to do that, not only in Iowa, but in the Midwest and beyond, if you remember that map of what they think the future of the country is going to look like with carbon pipelines, I think we can really stop this greenwashing scheme and redirect these resources and this money towards known climate solutions. And that's what we have to do if we're going to be serious about this climate crisis, because we can't kick the can down the road. We can't waste our public resources. We can't waste our public dollars. This is not good for the country, not good for the world. There's projects all across the world that are being pushed like this for these carbon credits and for different taxpayer dollars. It's wrong. And so we have to stand up and fight back right now so that we can keep ourselves on the track to real climate solutions and not end up in 30 years going, oh crap, that was a big waste of money and a big waste of time. And now there's no going back. So if you want more information and if you want to get involved either in the Midwest, supporting us somehow, or if you think your state's slated for carbon pipelines and you kind of want to get up to speed ahead of time, check out the Huffington Post article by Dan Ziegert, It's the Gassiness of Tarsha. It is a great first read when you're just digging into this, because it just lets you know how dangerous these are. And then all of a sudden you're going to want to know everything else about it. The Sierra Club Iowa chapter website, we keep it really updated with Iowa specific information. Science and Environmental Health Network has some great resources on how this is not a climate change solution and public money stuff. Center for International Environmental Law has also been a huge resource for some of their research, and they've been incredibly helpful. And then I put my name and email there. So thank you very much for letting me share this with you all. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Jess. This was amazing. So I really appreciate all this information you just shared with us. And there are lots of great questions, actually. But before we get to them, at the very end, you have the hashtag No Carbon Pipelines. And one of the things I thought was really interesting that you've brought up in the meetings that we're in together is that you have actually been tracking which way to phrase, the issue works best as a hashtag and that sort of thing, and which, search terms people have used more often than others. Can you explain that real quick?
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of webinars to just educate people on this because it's all so new. And YouTube has good little analytics that kind of tell you how are people finding your videos and what words are they searching. And carbon pipelines always has risen to the top, more than CO2 pipelines. Plus, I think carbon pipelines it's catchy. So that's what we've been calling it here. But yeah, that's kind of where we've been testing a lot of messaging to figure out what resonates.
Yeah, in fact, in the meetings that we are in together, and it's the Science and Environmental Health Network leading the charge there, and just mentioned them at the end, and there's a new website, Carbon Capture Facts, and we're going around and around based on Jess's research, trying to figure out exactly how to phrase this properly so that people find it, and it kind of sends the message that, they want to see, and it's not necessarily too much fist in the air, but more like factual.
Right. Right. And on messaging too, the pipeline companies have these fancy, pretty names for their pipelines, and we're refusing to use those names. We're going to call them by the name of their company, make sure it ties back. But the Summit ones, like the Midwest Carbon Express and Navigator's the Heartland Greenway. It's Navigator and Summit.
Well, let's get to the questions, and welcome to everybody who joined after just got started. So this is this monthly webinar that we're doing as the Voices Coalition, since we've been working on pipelines for such a long time. Now that this looming threat of CO2 pipelines is real and out there and coming, we thought it was really important to bring Jess here because of the amazing work that she's been doing. But every month, the second Friday of the month, we're going to be doing some related webinar. So Maya had asked the first question, and what's the applicable legal regime? Is it state law or federal law or both?
If I understand the question correctly, I think right now the big thing is going to be state law for us specifically in regards to stopping the permit. But I think that there's a lot of really important federal law as well. I don't think we have any of the protections that we need, like pipeline safety stuff for carbon pipelines, because these are still relatively new in the grand scheme of things. I think there's lots of different legal fights that we need to have on our hand at that. In Iowa, there's Dakota Access pipeline got approved, and it set precedent that eminent domain in Iowa can be used for private projects. So we're going to have a really big fight in Iowa trying to prove that these are not a public benefit. And I think we have a strong case because of how dangerous they are, because we know they're not a climate solution, and because the ethanol industry is going to harm people in the long run if we're putting all of our eggs in a basket and then focusing on states that are going to be decreasing their ethanol demand the quickest.
And FERC has no role thus far.
Yeah, Karen, you may actually know a little bit more about the federal, because I've been focusing so much on Iowa that I know that there's a lot needed at the federal level in terms of regulations and different protections.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be pretty much PHMSA and FERC. And even when it's a natural gas pipeline that's being approved, FERC, is in the driver's seat. And even if, the safety considerations at PHMSA aren't really taken into account as part of their process. And so we had heard early on that FERC might have a role in all of this, but I'd heard pretty decisively from Carolyn and others in Iowa, where you're already confronting this, that there really is no role for FERC in this. This is going to be done at the state level primarily, and then again some safety issues potentially with PHMSA and maybe other things like tax credits and the rest of it.
Yeah. And what's been interesting too, we've been really bringing it down to the local level too with these ordinances. We found that there's actually a lot that counties have the ability to do. Like, they're not going to have the final decision-making power, but they're so heavily engaged in the process that by putting roadblocks up in that process or making sure that they're being reimbursed for costs and everything like that, it helps us get this at all angles. And I think the local level is going to be really interesting because we're going to need their support to get the state level people to be able to say no.
Do you have zoning protection in Iowa?
We do, but I'm not sure that we can do a lot with zoning on these pipelines. We have a lot of preemption laws in Iowa. They don't like us to do anything that's stronger than state and federal standards.
I mean, that's one of the issues with fracking in this part of the world. And I know that for a lot of us in this coalition, especially, we're involved in fights like the Penn East pipeline. We've done municipal resolution campaigns because also at the federal level, FERC pretty much just exempts local governments from being able to have any real legal say in the matter. So the way to do it in this world is, part of the world, is to do these resolutions that have been powerful. Like you showed the map, you can see on our map of Penn East just the absolute route, because everybody along the route, opposed it. So, let's see. The next question is the CO2 used just for getting oil out of the ground, or is it also used to get natural gas out of the ground? I don't know if you know the answer.
Yeah, I don't know about natural gas. I hear mostly about the oil production. It can be used for a lot of other things too, but I think enhanced oil recovery really is the target for these pipelines, just because the oil industry wants to pump as much oil out of the ground as possible. And this helps them, this helps them stay in business. If we're trying to, in the ethanol industry, every gallon of gas that has ethanol in it also has fossil fuels in it too. So this is really the fossil fuel industry sitting behind the scenes benefiting from this without being front and center.
Um, Kirk Frost in the Q&A has another question related to, again, the federal involvement. And he asked, is there any federal agency that is even at least monitoring the grant funding for this? Do you know?
I do not know. To be honest, I focus so much on the Iowa stuff that I leave the federal stuff to groups like Science and Environmental Health Network and CL to explain that to me so then we can use that here in Iowa. But no, I know right now that the talks with like the 45Q federal tax credit is talks are about expanding it, not limiting it and not reining it in to make sure it's focused on climate change solutions. There's talk of increasing the price that people can get for sequestration or enhanced oil recovery. There's talk of extending the deadline to make this program last longer. So I think if there's any changes at the federal level, it's in the opposite direction that we want it to go.
Another question from the from the chat. My cat's knocking my headphone off. My cats. At what stage of the process did you first learn about these projects? Like, did you learn about it through the news, through filings with the government? And especially now there are 3, so, you had a heads up the second time, and the third time I imagine that you knew what to look out for. But could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the first we heard about it actually was from Carolyn Raffensperger, who works for Science and Environmental Health Network. She'd been hearing rumors and seeing some evidence of these proposals. But they didn't go public and announce anything until I believe it was late August, early September. So I think we found out we were clued in with Carolyn. I didn't really realize how big of a deal this was going to be at that point in time. But then when the announcement came, we're like, oh, this is real. This is big. We finally are seeing just the magnitude of it. But yeah, it was not something that the companies were really transparent about. They clearly were working on these projects for years in advance and purposely doing it behind the scenes, hoping that they could just slam this through before people could figure out what's wrong with it and why we should resist it. So we're really thankful to the organizations that have been paying attention to CCS ahead of time, because that allowed us to just hit the ground running with all the information that people already put together. All we had to do was take that information and turn it into action with these landowners, everyday Iowans.
Another question comes in asking about how supportive the other Sierra Club chapters are. So are there efforts going on in the other states where this is happening, or are you kind of driving the...
I know the Sierra Club Illinois chapter and Sierra Club Minnesota chapter are paying close attention, and the Nebraska chapter. I'm not familiar with the South Dakota or North Dakota chapter, but Sierra Club National is also starting to pay attention. I think that these are some things that we didn't really have in our plans. So it's been something we had to really change what we're working on and change our priorities to really put this front and center. So I think it's coming along, but yeah, it's starting to spread. And I think a lot of environmental groups are really starting to just say, oh, this is big. We need to get involved. We need to weigh in on this. I think it's slowly starting to come around with lots of different groups. But definitely Iowa's kind of leading the way right now in what the resistance looks like.
I mean, I find it interesting. I was thinking about it, that your background is really on the agricultural side of things, and that's the work that you've been doing, and that, so often we're in the same boat, working with landowners and farmers, and, and I don't remember, honestly, and it's something I think we should be talking about at Voices about, some of the agricultural organizations, or at least agricultural departments, divisions within organizations being more engaged in this.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, because Iowa is like home of industrial agriculture and agribusiness. They're so strong here. They control our political system, our electoral system, everything. And Farm Bureau is the biggest, and they are supposedly a farmer-led grassroots organization. I think they really are more of just an insurance company that focuses on policy that benefits themselves. But you'd think Farm Bureau would step up and protect their members right now. We've seen how Farm Bureau fights things like Water the US, where they go all in. They make videos, they have action alerts, they're sending texts, they're doing commercials, all of this stuff. And they've been pretty MIA on this. And I think that's really eye-opening to a lot of farmers who are saying, where's this organization that I am a member of, that I care so much about, that's supposed to represent me? We have had the Lynn County Farm Bureau has come out against it. And we have, like I said, the Iowa Farmers Union, which is fantastic. They're really going all in and not just saying they're against it, but actually going to start organizing on it. And then also the one that's really interesting is the Iowa Corn Growers Association recently said that they said, well, we're pro ethanol, but we're also pro landowner rights. So it was a really a soft way to say we don't think the pipeline is good for the eminent domain issue, but they also don't want to they're in the ethanol industry. So it's been really interesting. I think we do need a lot more farm groups weighing in, but I think it's really, this whole issue has really made people start to say, well, who's actually on my side and who's not? Like Governor Reynolds, I thought I loved Governor Reynolds. I voted for her and I voted for Branstad, but where are they now? And I think it's making people really say, well, what am I being told? Which of it is true? And who do I trust?
Really interesting.
Mhm.
Thanks. I see another question here about Iowa State getting input from tribal nations. How is it different? How they value tribal nations versus landowners?
Yeah, that's really, really important. In Iowa, there is one tribe, the Meskwaki. They have not been super engaged in this one yet. Some of their members have been, some of their citizens have been, but they were very heavily engaged during Dakota Access. So I think we'll see more engagement as we learn more. And then the Great Plains Action Society is a organization that works with Indigenous people in Iowa and outside of Iowa, and they're meeting weekly with us. And they're actually going to be putting on a webinar. We did a joint webinar last week where we kind of just did a really brief overview of each of the reasons people are against them, and then we're going to dig in on each issue in a separate webinar. And I think our next one, just because it was fascinating, the landowners sent me emails after the webinar, and there was a lot of interest in the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue. And so I think that's going to be our next webinar, where we really focus on human trafficking and Indigenous issues. And then I know in other states that have a much larger Indigenous population, be like Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, they are meeting with their tribal governments. There are some groups that actually tried to intervene in South Dakota into the process, and the Indigenous communities were denied an intervention, which I think is a major problem. And they should be able to weigh in, because right now these pipelines, as they're proposed, don't go through any tribal land, reservation land, even though it's all stolen land. I always make sure I say that it's not going through their areas right now. But same with Dakota Access. It wasn't until last minute that it switched from Bismarck down to Standing Rock. And so I think that they have every reason to be able to intervene and weigh in and be part of the process, because we know that these pipelines are going to reroute at some point. But yeah, there's been a lot of engagement. The pipeline companies also keep saying that they are doing a lot of tribal engagement as well. And from what I'm hearing on the ground, like, with who? I don't think you've met with anyone. Or who are you meeting with? Who is this group of Indigenous leaders that you claim to have support from? So I think that that's something that we need to do a lot more with. But it's definitely happening in a coordination.
Great. And I think we have time for maybe two more questions, but I wanted to give Maya an opportunity, because she asked if you were aware of the Green Amendment proposal being put forth in Iowa. I don't know, Maya, if you want to jump on for a second and explain.
Yeah. So I just had to. That's why I also was interested to know that there's so much state authority here. Do you know what a Green Amendment is?
I do not.
Okay. So a Green Amendment is a provision that gets added to the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution that recognizes and protects the right to the people to clean water, clean air, a stable climate, and healthy environment, and the duty of government officials to protect the natural resources of the state for present and future generations. And by virtue of its placement and its language, it makes the right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment constitutionally recognized and protected in the same powerful way we recognize and protect property rights, gun rights, speech rights, religious freedom. So it's very, very powerful. And I have another hat as the founder of the Green Amendment movement and the organization Green Amendments for the Generations. There are only green amendments of this kind in 3 states, most recently New York, and they have been used, they're not a panacea, but have been used in really powerful ways. Given the level of state authority here, a green amendment could be very powerful help in states that are dealing with these pipelines. And I want you to know there's a green amendment proposal in the state of Iowa
That may be
started to advance.
okay. That may be because I know Senator Hogue has something that's like a right to a clean environment, which might be.
This is going to be this is Representative Eisenhart. Now I'll look to see if they're a co-sponsor because sometimes people are playing with language and doing the placement. So it's pretty language, but it doesn't have enforceable strength like other fundamental rights. So if you're interested in learning more, it could be a powerful weapon. And given the approval process, it would take some time in Iowa to get it.
Because we have to go through 2 general assemblies and vote of the people to get a constitutional amendment change. Yeah, we need it.
That's the thing is, and given these battles are going to go on for a long while, I wanted to make sure that you were aware, because I think it would be really great if you all sort of added it to your package of thinking. And way back when it was first announced in Iowa, by Rep. Eisenhart, a Sierra Club chapter did stand up with him. So
Awesome.
be happy to follow up with you, and
Yeah.
wanted to make sure you were aware because it could be a powerful weapon if it got passed.
Thank you, Maya.
Thank you. Great presentation. So helpful.
Well, we're right at 11 o'clock, and so I want to thank you so much, Jess, for doing this, and your presentation just knocked it out of the park. So thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you in an hour, I think. And I also want to mention again, we're doing this every month. Kirk, I saw you had a lot of questions about federal level things in the Q&A, and so I didn't want you to think that we're ignoring them. It's just I don't know that those are questions that Jess can answer. But there is somebody that we've been wanting to get on who I think can address every one of your questions. June is going to, she had volunteered to be one of our speakers, and she is an expert at that federal level stuff. So so please tune in when we have her, and I'll try to get her for next time. But just again, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate
it. Inviting me. It was great to share the work that's happening here in Iowa, and I hope we can replicate this all across the country.
Yay. Well, we hope we don't have to, but we're probably going to have to. So thank you. And I can't thank you enough for that excellent presentation, and we'll share the recording after.